Ladies and gentlemen, as you continue to enjoy your lunch, I would like to introduce our head table. Please hold your applause until I introduce everyone. Seated to my far right, your left, Bo Durosnovic, Managing Director of Engines at American Airlines, a legislative benefactor. Rodrigo Rojas, External Affairs Manager at Public Service Company of Oklahoma, a legislative benefactor. Jeff Hewson, Vice President of Rates and Regulatory at One Gas, a corporate sponsor and legislative benefactor. Kim Teehee, Cherokee Nation Delegate to Congress and Senior Vice President of Government Relations at Cherokee Nation Businesses, a corporate sponsor and legislative benefactor. Jennifer Jezik, President of Sovereign Stewardship and immediate past chair of the Tulsa Regional Chamber. Mike Neal, President and CEO of the Tulsa Regional Chamber. U.S. Congressman Kevin Hern. Bill Knight, President of Bill Knight Automotive Group, 2025 Chair of the Tulsa Regional Chamber, and Tulsa Tech Hall of Famer. Seated to my immediate left, your right, John Jennings, Director of Strategy and Corporate Operations at Community Care, a corporate sponsor and legislative benefactor. Nathan Reese, Executive Vice President of External Relations at Grand River Dam Authority, a corporate sponsor and legislative benefactor. Roger Ramsayer, Tulsa Market Vice President of Cox Communications, a legislative benefactor. And no, I did not steal your chocolate cake today. Dr. Bo Burns, Interim Dean of the School of Community Medicine at OU, a legislative benefactor. Morgan Wilson, Government Affairs Specialist at Quick Trip, a legislative benefactor. And Phil Lakin, Jr., CEO of the Tulsa Community Foundation, representing the George Kaiser Family Foundation, a legislative benefactor and chair of the Tulsa City Council. In addition to these sponsors seated at the head table, we owe a special thanks to the Robson Companies, a gold sponsor, and One Oak, a legislative benefactor and private meeting sponsor. Also, thank you to each of our silver and corporate table sponsors listed on your programs. Please join me in thanking all of our sponsors for their support. We also have some local elected officials and congressional office representatives joining us today. Would you all please stand and be recognized? It's now my privilege to introduce Congressman Kevin Hern. Born on an Air Force base, Kevin gained an early appreciation for the sacrifices of military families make. At a career technology school, he earned an architectural drafting certificate, which he used to work and pay for his engineering degree. Later in life, he earned his MBA. He went on to work as an aerospace engineer for Rockwell. He then began saving to purchase his first McDonald's restaurant by starting small business ventures, including real estate, hog farming, and writing computer programs. In 1997, Representative Hern sold the hog farm to buy his first McDonald's restaurant in North Little Rock. In 1999, he purchased 2 McDonald's restaurants in Muskogee. He expanded that organization during the next decade, eventually owning 24 McDonald's restaurants that employed hundreds of people in the Tulsa area. In addition to McDonald's, Representative Hern has been a successful opportunity in the areas of banking, manufacturing, real estate, multiple technology companies, and sports publishing. Representative Hern was sworn into Congress on November 13, 2018. He is now chairman of the House Republican Policy Committee and sits on the House Committee on Ways and Means. Kevin and his wife Tammy live in Tulsa and have 3 children. Now, a bit of trivia, the Congressman's favorite item at McDonald's is not a Happy Meal, but a double quarter pounder with cheese. Please join me in welcoming U.S. Representative Kevin Hern. It's now my pleasure to invite Congressman Hern and Bill Knight down to the stage. We have a slightly different format for today's Congressional Forum. To best grasp some policy and political challenges facing our nation right now, Bill Knight is going to sit down with Congressman Hern to talk about the important work happening in the Congressman's office and in Washington. Bill, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Congressman.
It's great to be here.
Visiting us today. We really appreciate that. I'm here to ask the tough questions, I think.
I've heard about you.
Yeah. I know. Okay, so I thought it would be a great place to start on the one beautiful bill that was passed I know you were a big part of that. A couple of things.
I didn't get into the naming business of that, by the way.
Good.
No.
Yeah, you have someone that does that for you. So, but I think we want to talk about a few things in it. And I think the first one is how we restore the immediate R&D expensing to kind of spur innovation, competition, and you spoke about that, how that affects the oil and gas industry in Oklahoma. I thought maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, I think, when you look at bipartisanship, because I know people in this room don't think there's such a thing in Washington, D.C. or in politics in general, I would tell you it's probably the most bipartisan thing in Congress, which is taking care of our small businesses. Whether it's immediate expensing on research and development that's been around since 1954, that I'll be quite frank with you that the Republican Party in 2017 messed that up by using that as a pay-for other things that they needed, thinking that everybody would support it going forward in 2022. Didn't happen, so we had an expiration, or basically what happened was it started being amortized for all the business people in the room. And why that's really important is it's something you can really measure. And businesses have a responsibility to innovate, develop, manufacture products that's going to make them more relevant, not only in Oklahoma or the United States, but around the world. And so we actually could see in 2022 the fall off of research and development in America. And you say, why is that important? Because you think about the people in your companies that do research and development. It's engineers, it's chemists, it's scientists. And the people we educate in our universities. And we started seeing this move around the world, especially to China. And to give you just kind of how this looks like on research and development, the Chinese government are very smart. They take advantage of our failures, which is what you're supposed to be doing as a very smart, astute competitor. And so they saw this fall off, so they went to strategic industries like our chip processing, chip manufacturing, some of our technology companies, and said, we'll give you 200% immediate expensing on your research and development. So compare that to the United States. Up until July 4th of this year, for a period of time, 3 years, for every dollar we spent on research and development, you only got 20-cent deduction in year one. The Chinese, for the same company, would give you $2 for every dollar spent. So we saw this fall off, had to be fixed, came out of Ways and Means bipartisan, 40-3, passed the floor of the House, went to the Senate, and again, Republicans in the minority killed it because they thought we shouldn't have some of the offsets and low-income housing tax credits that were associated with that. But it's back, it's restored, immediate expensing on equipment, it's permanent. When you look at immediate expensing on structures, it's a way to reconstitute manufacturing in America very quickly. So anything that's been put into construction January 19th this year and then put in production by 2031, or 2028 rather, will be allowed to be immediate expensed on structures, buildings. So a lot of positive things for businesses.
Yeah, thank you. I think, that's probably one of the most challenging parts of that bill is just how big it was and how many things it touched on. The one thing that we've all heard a lot about is Medicare, Medicaid, and how it may affect, especially in a state like Oklahoma, with a lot of rural hospitals. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and maybe help kind of clarify some of the things that we have coming forward on that.
Well, I think the real reality is that there's a lot that we don't know right now. I know there's a lot that's projected. When you look at the cuts, the president said during the campaign trail, don't touch Medicare recipients, don't touch Social Security recipients, and don't touch Medicaid recipients. Senator Goodwin and I were just having a lovely debate, weren't we, about whether or not, we were just friendly conversation about does it really going to impact our individuals? Well, I think if it were to happen today, if it went into effect today, there's probably not going to be a time to adjust any of these or really truly understand what the impacts are. And so there's a lot of fear. Anytime there's changes, whether it's in our state government or federal government, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a couple of reasons. One, I'll give you your due, political, and why this doesn't take place until 28. But more importantly, it's about adjustments. We've got a lot of great medical institutions, insurance companies in our state, specifically in Tulsa. I know them all very well. They know my door is open to have a dialogue. And I think over the next 24 months, we're going to have to see, because let's just be honest, none of us in this room, Democrat or Republican, or people who don't care about politics, we want to help everybody that needs help. What we don't want to do is waste benefits on people who are able to take care of themselves. At 80% plus most popular thing in America is for people to work if they're able to work in America. And some will say, well, that's a failed experiment. But the Congressional Budget Office estimates, that both sides demonize in Washington, D.C., estimates there's 4.8 million people in America today that are receiving benefits that they shouldn't be getting. And if they're going to get them, we're not saying you're not going to get them, but you say you got to work 20 hours a week, you got to get workforce development training 20 hours a week, or you've got to do volunteer work for 20 hours a week. Any of those would apply, and you still get your benefits. And some say, well, that's a failed experiment as well. Well, I remind us all, and some of us in this room, many of us in this room are old enough to remember 1996 when President Clinton then did the same exact thing. He said, you got to work, you're going to get 5 years worth of benefits. And it was somewhat unpopular then, but it proved to be what gave us 4 years of budget surpluses in America. And what it also said was, and I'm going to expand on a little bit of that whole same time, many of the things you're hearing today exactly are the same talking points he used then in his administration. The difference is there was no internet, there was no social media, there were no cell phones, and he said the same thing. You know, the era of big government is over, and we're going to shrink the size of government. Then Vice President Al Gore said there's a lot of wasteful spending in Washington, D.C., and we're going to eliminate it. Al Gore, the guy who invented the internet. So the same talking points today are being said, and it's like, you know, everybody's got, you know, three eyes, and they're trying to destroy America. President Bill Clinton laid off 377,000 government workers. They didn't have the ability to do internet or social media, and they didn't have multiple channels. So they went around to Chamber of Commerce's around the country to listen to everybody tell them, I've read the stories, about how they were going to destroy America. They didn't destroy America. They made America better. So we're working to do that. Nobody in this room wants to destroy America, contrary to what all the news media says.
Yeah, thank you. Now let's pivot to kind of an area that's certainly near and dear to my heart, and that is tariffs. I think as you know, what we've seen in terms of the implementation of tariffs over the last couple of months has certainly been a little start-stop. I think most of the business owners are just looking for more of a durable policy there. I'm just curious from a congressional standpoint, what can be done to try to create a more durable, consistent issue as we go forward?
Thank you. And I think, you know, what everybody that's ever talked to me, it doesn't matter party. I'm listening to you all in the room, and I want to answer questions. I want to get your feedback. And when you sit next to Bill Knight for a 3-hour flight, right next to him literally, when this all started back earlier this year, you get to hear how this is impacting at the grassroots level. This is important. This is stuff we share with the administration. But I want to shamelessly borrow, the comments that two of my Democrat colleagues said last week on a panel that we were on talking about tariffs and tax policy on a global basis. And this was brought up. And Linda Sanchez, who is from California, who's been on Ways and Means Committee a lot longer than I, said this, and I'm going to associate myself with her words, is that if we use tariffs as a negotiating tool to get people to the table, I'm all for it. If we're using them as a weapon, I'm not. I'm exactly the same position as probably one of the most liberal persons on Ways and Means Committee. I am all for getting people to the table because it's much easier to get them to you got to get them at the table and negotiate. I can't negotiate over emails, snail mail, Zoom calls. It's just impossible. So as long as the president is using these for negotiations, I'm all for it. But we've got to implement trade policy. There's not been there's only been one trade deal done since NAFTA. NAFTA was 1994, and that was modifying NAFTA with USMCA. We have not, the Trade Subcommittee on Ways and Means has not done anything in 30 years, and that's been pointed out by one of my other colleagues, a Democrat, that we have got to make sure that we're doing our job in Congress when it comes to trade.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things certainly that's come from the tariffs is a lot of reshoring back to the U.S. If you can talk a little bit about where Oklahoma is uniquely positioned to take advantage of that, and do you see that growing as we move forward?
Well, I think, and I said this before I went to Congress when we were talking about this in President Trump when he was running for office. I just didn't see why any business would come back to America in those circumstances then, because you're not going to come back and spend $1 billion on a building that you have to amortize for 39 years, or buy equipment that you had to amortize over 5 or 10 or 15 years. It just didn't make sense, because one of the nuances you get with our representative republic is that the leader of this country changes, the whole direction of the country can change in 4 years. Two terms of the House, one with the president, and then, you know, 2/3 of the Senate every 4 years. So it just doesn't make sense. I could never comprehend this. I can comprehend it now. When we can give immediate expensing, we've eliminated those excuses, Bill, where people in business now have to make those determinations. Do I want to do business here? And you're seeing, you know, upwards of $1 trillion, maybe a little bit more, that are committed. You know, Apple alone is $600 billion. Do I like the blunt force trauma that I'm seeing out of the White House from time to time? No, but I'm not president of the United States. Would I do business that way? I've never done business that way, so some of it's foreign to me, quite frankly. But, you know, will all of it work? No. Did the president get everything in this bill that he wanted? Absolutely not. And so it's one of those things that happens every time there is a majority of the House, the Senate, and the White House of the same party. Everybody gets their thing. It's never perfect. And then every single time, as the Senator and I were talking about, every single time these things get modified down the road, whether it's the Affordable Care Act, whether it's 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, whether it's ARPA, whether it's IRA, and this will be no different. And so it's going to be real important as we go forward, and go back to your Medicaid conversation. It's really important as we go forward that we see what happens in Oklahoma, because I believe the folks in my district and the folks across the state that are professionals in this space to give me, you know, concrete, not hypotheticals, but concrete feedback of what they see happening. Because if you look at everything right now that's being reported, it's not definitive. It's could, might, possibly, suggested that it might. It's because people don't know. And I'll give you just one last example of that. If you believed everything that was going to happen in January or February, you would sold every piece of stock you had in America or in the world and buried all your money because it was over. And now we're at record stock levels just, you know, 3 months after that. So I think everything is changing. Things are being readjusted, and we're going to see where it's going to go.
Yeah, thank you. Let's turn now to infrastructure. Just had some new legislation that came. Certainly important, transportation, broadband, all the things that are in the bill. I'm just curious if you could talk about, from an infrastructure standpoint, how can Oklahoma be best positioned to take advantage of that?
Yeah, every time I get asked that question, I think about the first time I ever went to Washington, D.C., and I was 45 years old. And I remember I was up there to see then Senator Tom Coburn, and I'm a pilot, as many of you know, and I flew him all over the state in my little Bonanza, and it was about the temperature outside it is right now, about 110 in an un-air-conditioned airplane, very hot. And so we were up there with our two boys, and Tammy and I were standing on the Washington Mall, and for a guy that's an engineer, loves to build things, look around, it was in awe of these magnificent buildings. We had lunch with Senator, and I remember him saying, I asked the question, I said, how in the world do we pay for all this? And he gave me a history lesson very quickly, and he said, every great civilization has failed because it failed to maintain its infrastructure. We're no different. Much has been talked about the FBI building and moving out of the FBI building. But when you get away from the media and you start talking to people who actually worked there, it was rat infested, the walls were falling apart, decaying. They look beautiful from the outside because they're marble, but inside they're no different than this, and they're falling apart. When I first got to Congress just 6 years ago in the Cannon office building, you could not drink the water. It would kill you to drink the water, literally out of a fountain in the Cannon office building, built in 1906, still had the same plumbing. So we've got to maintain our infrastructure. There's nobody knew more about that than the late Senator Inhofe. I don't know if there are any staffers in this room, but this man was relentless of getting water in the river. From the time he was mayor, state rep, state senator, I mean, the list went on and on. Talked about it on his governor's campaign, in the state, in the federal government, on the House side, in the Senate. And it was, you know, I'm sure he's looking down at what happened last week and signing the documents to finally get the levies to make sure that we don't have, you know, what we saw with the River Spear Casino in May of 2019, what we saw with our refineries having to put up, you know, blockades to keep the water from encroaching on the refineries and contaminating downstream. The calls that I got, I mean, I was in office 5 months, and I was getting call from our city managers at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning saying, we need help. We'd never seen this event. This was supposed to only going to happen every 300 to 500 years, right? That was the statistical when it was going to happen. You know, it's not that we're going to see this again in 300 years from now. It could happen at any time. We had people in Sand Springs that I was over there with the folks in the levee district, the Corps folks. We were having to move people out behind the levees because we were afraid they were going to collapse and cause catastrophic problems. So what's happened with the zinc dam, this goes all the way back, probably predates Senator Inhofe, but we finally are going to get it done. It's so important to Tulsa. What's going to happen on downstream, south of Jinx, is going to be important for Tulsa, for Tulsans, and I look forward to that. We work very closely with the Corps of Engineers on everything that's happening on you know, the McClellan-Kerr, the M-Carns. Things are very important to Oklahoma. Our infrastructure is huge. Our highway system's huge. And I think we just need to make sure we don't have potholes that we can't drive our cars on anymore.
I agree. I think we all agree with that. Thank you. As most of us look forward into the balance of the year, there's been a lot of news around interest rates and the Federal Reserve, whether they're going to hold rates, lower rates. I'm curious your thoughts about what you see in the coming months with the Federal Reserve.
Is Rose here, by the way? Is she here today? She's a real expert on this. But, you know, what's interesting, Chairman Powell is, there's probably no human being in Washington, D.C. taking more lumps. And, you know, some maybe rightly so. He's not a trained economist. You know, he's a finance guy that got the job by the very guy that's kind of knocking knots on his head right now. But the reality is he's got an unruly job to do. When the feds were set up, by the way, and, you know, I've been in the banking business. We got some great bankers in the room, but the Fed was set up in 1913 because they were afraid that community banks were going to take over the Western expansion. And really smart people around the world came together and said, we got to create price stability, so we need to set up our third federal bank. And that's the one we have today. And then in the 60s and 70s, they said, well, we got to figure out how we're going to deal with unemployment. So let's add that mandate to monetary policy and easing, you know, quantitative easing, selling bonds, and so forth and so on, creating debt. And so here we are now. We've evolved over the last, you know, 112 years to what we have today. Chairman Powell is a person that I know fairly well. One of my first luncheons I had, I always invited speakers in every week. And my first speaker was Chairman Powell. And he told me outside, and we have a common friend in the Finance Committee, Chairman French Hill from Little Rock. French and he went to the Treasury as interns back in the day. So we're talking, and Chairman Powell looked at me and he goes, Congressman, he said, I'll answer every question that I can, but I can't do anything that will damage the economy. You know, there were no cameras in the room. That was afterwards, but he didn't want anybody recording this unknowingly. We sat in there for an hour and 15 minutes. He answered every single question from 112 Republicans in the room, including the Majority Leader, Steve Scalise. But the two things that really stuck in my mind, this has been 3 years ago now, that he said, at that time we had 11 million job openings and 5 million people looking. And he looked at us and he gave us a warning from a fiscal policy and our policy in general. He said, my job is full employment. Your job is to get people to work. We both got to do our jobs. And he said, I'll do my job, I can assure you, because as I continue to hold interest rates flat, squeeze monetary policy, jobs will stop being created. But you guys have got to put people to work. There are too many people that should be working that are not working. And so you've seen that gap close. Still not enough. But there's always going to be this little bit of unemployment or unemployable situation as somebody that's been in the business for 35 years of hiring people. But I think the chairman's done a pretty fantastic job in a very difficult environment. Not because necessarily his monetary policy, but he's had to put up with the terrible fiscal policy of the Congress. Because you think about it, it's our job to start figuring out how we're going to deal with deficits and debts. Because at the end of the day, he has to control the interest that we pay on those debts. And can bring confidence in the world that the United States is still a great place to invest. So it takes us working hand in glove together. For the first time in many, I think, decades, you saw two of the Fed governors break from the chairman last month. So it's going to be interesting to see what he says this Friday in Jackson Hole about the future of the country. It'll probably be his last presentation before all of the policymakers, so we'll see where it goes. But I think he's doing as good a job as he possibly can.
Yeah, when you think about what he's navigated through the last few years, I certainly agree. Well, let's zoom out for a minute from Oklahoma and the U.S. And obviously what's been in the news a lot internationally is Russia, Ukraine, trying to bring that to some conclusion. We talked a little bit about it during the private meeting. I think everybody would appreciate your thoughts about Russia, about Ukraine, and about China, and how they're all connected.
Yeah, I think it's important. I've never voted for the Ukraine spending, not because I love Russia, or not because I hate Ukraine. It's because I care about being fiduciarily responsible for the taxpayer dollars of the United States of America. I care about you. I do. And when I was, I've asked this question in a very secure setting. I'll just leave it at that. And I ask it of the highest ranking officials of DOD, intelligence community. This has probably been 24 months ago now. If I could magically write you a check for $300 billion, how quickly would the war end, and how would you do it? I got no answer. Which affirmed that what we have seen from time to time in our history is that these things get on momentum. We saw this 20 years in Afghanistan, that we don't really have an end in sight, and we're just going to continue spending money until somebody changes the dynamics. Also, what we know is that the EU buys 3 times as much energy from Russia than it gives in support of Ukraine. And you think about what I just said. The EU buys 3 times as much energy from Russia than it gives in support to Ukraine. So here's our Western allies buying, 1/3, 2/3 in relation to their spending and helping end the war in Ukraine. You saw recently India getting a 50% tariff put on it. Not because of their egregious actions between Tata Industries, the United States, and so forth and so on, but because of their aggressive purchasing of energy from Russia. Until we actually stop that, which has more impact than us trying to put sanctions on Russia, until we stop that, this war will never end. I was telling the group earlier that I was at an event 1 year ago, and they described how impactful what I just told you is. And at that time, 1 year ago, that if the EU, China, and India stopped buying oil and gas from Russia, Russia would steal 7 years of cash on the balance sheet to execute the war in Ukraine. So until that happens, and Putin sees this happening, this war will never end. Never end.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that insight. I know yesterday you were with the Secretary of Education. I thought, kind of timely to talk about education and maybe what you guys saw yesterday and just generally where you see education and the administration's policy toward it.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of these events with business owners and groups around the city, and I've been asked, what do I think the two most, we hear about, Oklahoma, people moving to Oklahoma, a lot of the things happening here from industries wanting to come here, the great work the Chamber's doing, and other people in the space here, the Kaiser Foundation, all the different groups are bringing people in. What are the two things that keep me up at night about Oklahoma? The first one is, which is the second one, I guess the second most important, is healthcare in Oklahoma. I grew up in Arkansas, so it's I know this world we all live in. We've got to get a healthier Oklahoma, and I know we have some great institutions. A lot of things we're doing. The Level 1 Trauma Center that's happened in St. John's. All the different things that happen. I know St. Francis is working on this. We're doing a lot of great work. What's happening at OU and their cancer research? Phenomenal things going on in Oklahoma. So I think we're on a path forward. I know my colleagues in here from Crest, St. John's, and St. Francis will keep me apprised. They've never had a problem doing that, what's happening in healthcare in Oklahoma. And we have a very robust conversations about this. But the most important thing, and this goes to all my business friends in here, you can have the best product in America, in the world. If you don't have great people, you really don't have a company. I will tell you this, if we don't figure out our education situation, not only in Oklahoma, but America, we're not going to have a great state. We're not going to have a great America. We continue to decline in the world standings on education, And there are things that give me hope. And yesterday, I didn't know Linda McMahon. I met her one time in a rose garden about 2 months ago with signing a bill for Melania Trump. And she said she was going to come to Oklahoma. And so we got notification last week she was coming. And she went to Vanguard Academy, part of the Broken Arrows school system. Very impressive. It's always good to see this because, none of us in this room are proud about our 50th ranking in education. It used to be in Arkansas. We said, thank God for Mississippi because we'd be 50. And now Arkansas is 36 or so. If you've seen the miracle in Mississippi, what's happened there, they've gone from dead last to 13th in fourth grade readings. That's because leadership in Mississippi made that a priority, not politics, but educating students. And I think when you look at the grand scheme of education in America, and I've said this to the leaders of Joe Harris, then former OSU President Casey Schramm, both I know well. I've said this to the board at TU. I'll say this to everybody. I said it to the chancellor of Vanderbilt, who was in my office about 3 weeks ago. Universities across America, higher ed, education, needs to get back into the educating of children and get out of the political world. And I say this to everybody that's in education. It's unabashed, and I know pretty much everybody in our education system in Oklahoma. Teachers want to teach. One of the greatest comments that were made yesterday to Secretary McMahon, listen, she's been around a while. She's pretty wealthy in her own right. She's seen the dog and pony shows that get put on. But we were walking back after going through the orchestrated meetings, and Chuck Perry's a dear friend. We were walking through, and she just pivoted. There was a gentleman sitting over, a student sitting over by a wall reading his book, and she just walked right over to him, unscripted, and started talking to him. And I thought, I'm going to walk over there and see what she's saying to him. And she's talking to him about what he thinks about the place. He's a 10th grader, talked about all the great things. He just repeated everything she just heard on the scripted tour. No teachers around, no orchestration. And he talked about, I love coming to work here. Every classroom that I went to, I kind of just was in trail in many of these. Every teacher said, I love teaching here. That's what we need. These are the days. I grew up in public schools. My wife went to public schools in Arkansas. Public schools are good. We got to make sure that. You heard the AG talk about his plan for governor yesterday. He talked about, we got to make sure parents have the opportunity to send their kids to school. You heard the secretary say this yesterday. We as parents got to make sure our kids can get an education because it's the best legacy that we can ever give them.
Great, thank you. I think we all agree. So as we come to an end, I think one of the things that, as I've gotten to know you over the years, that we all appreciate is that you're not a career politician. You're a background in business. You entered the Congress at a time of extreme bipartisanship. And I think the group would be interested in just your take on how to be effective, how to keep your perspective on things when it does seem like you're either way over here or way over here. And then maybe, so talk about that, and then maybe kind of where you see yourself moving in your political career.
Yeah, so I've known you for about 20 years, I think, long before I ever got in politics. I've known Mike Neal probably longer, and he said I wouldn't have done the introduction of you about your bio. I would just said you have a great wife, and I would first tell you that my wife takes the brunt of all of my frustrations of Washington, D.C. It is a very frustrating place to see how good we could be for our citizens in moving forward. There are, nobody's right. Nobody's perfect in that place. And for my colleagues at the state level, I know you know that. But it's even exacerbated on the federal level just because there's so much attention. There's not a time that I don't walk off the floor of the House. There's probably anywhere from 10 to 20 press members follow me everywhere asking questions. I respect their job. But, if in the business world, you don't negotiate every single word that you say in front of a press, where it's parsed out, every single time. It's very difficult. So it is refreshing for both parties, individuals, to not have a camera in front of our face. We actually have a great time together. I always tell this story because I think it's important. Who you are is known in Congress. And I have a tremendous number of friends that would shock you that are my friends in Congress. One is AOC. And some of the pranks that we've pulled on some Republicans in this district, you would really laugh about if I had time to tell you the stories. But when I first got on Ways and Means, I was in the minority, so I was like the low totem pole, last to speak, nobody left in the room kind of a guy. And I got a message from a guy that I had no clue who this was. This was 4 years ago. And he said, I know you have a high level of interest in international tax, and we've got to deal with this issue with foreign tax credits in Brazil. Would you want to co-sponsor a bill with me? This guy's name is Brad Schneider. Never met the guy in my life. Well, I said, yes, I'll do anything to get something going on here. And so I'd been in Congress 3 years at that time. And so we started working on this process. He walks down the middle of the aisle toward me, and on the floor of the House, I had no idea who it was. I remember it was just 3 years in. And he said, hey, my name is Brad Schneider. You're probably going to want to talk to Treasury, because President Biden was in office. He said, I want to set up a call so you can ask questions of Treasury, because as you know, they're never going to take your call. So we did a Zoom call, and Brad said to the Treasury people, he said, Congressman Hern, like me, cares about jobs in America. We're very concerned, he said, we are very concerned about what's happening with the administration, with Treasury on tax policy in Brazil and how it relates to our great companies, specifically like Caterpillar. And I want you to listen to him. He never said another word. They had me 30 minutes. They gave me 45. And at the end, he said, I just want to reemphasize, I agree with everything he said. So contrary to popular belief, we do get along. Sometimes we disagree. Sometimes we just tell people that we're never going to support them, but we love what their efforts. But just remember this, every single member of Congress got elected to be there. Every single member of Congress is representing their districts or they won't get reelected. And the President of the United States, as I mentioned earlier, every 4 years he changed the direction of the country. 77.3 million people supported him to change the direction of the country. In 4 years, if 77.3 million want to change a different direction, respect that for our nation. That's what makes us special. And as I've traveled the world talking about tax policy, after about 2 hours of conversation, the leaders of those countries will say, we are envious, we are so envious of your type of politics and your government. And I'm thinking, you guys are crazy. But anyway, and the reason they say that is because we can have this kind of dialogue in a room. Because anybody in America can become something. That's the opportunities we have. I can assure you, 60 years ago in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas, 53 years ago in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas, a guy like me with no running water, no indoor plumbing, never dreamed that he could meet the President of the United States or sit in the White House or make policy for all Americans regardless of party. We have a special place. We need not destroy it. We need to respect it. We need to respect our disagreements. We need to agree to disagree many times, but it's still the greatest place in this world to be. That's why there's so many people wanting to come here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. And I think I can speak for the whole group that we appreciate your candidness, we appreciate your transparency, and sometimes it's hard to get like clear thinking and clear communication, and I hope you guys got that today, and we really appreciate you in Oklahoma.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, and Congressman Hern, thank you again for being here, for your service representing our state in Washington. Bill, I'm not sure what your favorite meal is at McDonald's, but as you know, the congressman does drive a Ford truck. I do know that. Before we adjourn, I'd like to make you aware of a couple of upcoming Chamber events. Next Thursday, the Chamber is hosting its annual State of the State. This year, Lieutenant Governor Matt Pinnell will provide the keynote address, then lead a conversation with former Oklahoma Governors Mary Fallin, Brad Henry, and Frank Keating. This is one of the Chamber's signature events, so we hope to see you there. Looking ahead, we invite you to join us for the Tulsa Regional Tourism Annual Meeting on Tuesday, September 9th from 8 to 10 a.m. at the RS Convention Center. This signature event highlights the achievements of the Tulsa Regional Tourism during the past fiscal year, recognizes outstanding leaders in our tourism industry, and shares a vision for the year ahead. It is an excellent opportunity to connect with partners and celebrate Tulsa's continued growth as a premier destination. The Chamber's Education Leadership Summit is coming up on September 10th. The Education Leadership Summit is a breakfast gathering focused on advancing regional education leadership, celebrating schools, organizations, and programs dedicated to developing a highly qualified workforce. The event will feature a panel discussion on how artificial intelligence is being used in workforce training. Area superintendents will also deliver key updates on their districts. Lastly, we ask you to mark your calendars for the One Voice Regional Legislative Summit on November 5th at the Discovery Lab. This is your chance to get together with other Chamber members to help shape the 2026 One Voice Regional Legislative Agenda. Task forces are meeting throughout the fall to generate policy positions and legislative priorities for consideration on the 2026 One Voice Agenda. The top priority from each task force is automatically added to the agenda, and attendees at the summit will deliberate and vote on which of the remaining priorities will be included. The summit is free to attend, but you must be a Chamber member or representative from an organization endorsing the agenda to vote on the priorities. You can register for these and other upcoming events on the Chamber's website at tulsachamber.com/events. I want to appreciate how all of our sponsors today for their generous support in making today's Congressional Forum possible. Please take note of the businesses listed in your program and call them whenever possible. Thank you for joining us. We are adjourned.